Marshall's role in the space program is critical. It always has been. I mean, you think back, what made Apollo 11 successful? Well, getting to the moon was the big thing, right? I mean, once you get there, there's a lot of complicated things that have to happen. But Marshall's role primarily was in lifting from Earth. I mean, so you think about the Saturn V. In Huntsville, people are familiar with the Saturn V. It dominates the landscape, right? You're driving down 565, you see the big Saturn V out there. I mean, Huntsville's the rocket city, and that's the association of the rocketry, right? That big, powerful, 7.5 million pounds of thrust kind of a thing. So Marshall's role in the space program, Marshall's role in the Apollo program was huge. Marshall developed back even into the Army days, ABMA back then, the Von Braun team that transferred over to Marshall to NASA in 1960, they brought with them just this huge amount of experience that they had in developing rockets, had been developing rockets for decades by that point. So when Marshall's created that program, the Mercury program that was going on at the time, to try to really learn how to lift people into orbit. I mean, that was the thing, just getting people into what we considered space. Alan Shepard's launch in 1961, I mean, that was, a Marshall booster. That's what that was. So we learned a lot during those programs and very quickly just exceeded into what was the Saturn I. Now the Saturn I was completely different, right? It's a H1 engines, 8 H1 engines for a booster stage that's going to really be the first rocket that was about lifting peaceful things into orbit. I mean, you got to remember the Mercury program was about the Redstone. It was about launching a nuclear weapon. But now with Saturn I, it was going to be, for the first time ever, a huge booster that served no military purpose at the time. So the Saturn I was difficult. The folks out here called it a plumber's nightmare, right? Because you're clustering all of these different engines together. Very complicated technical stuff. And that work was done here. It's different than the way we do it now. Back then it was called an arsenal system. People here at Marshall actually bent the metal. They did the tests. Everything was learned here. And then they passed it over to the contractors after that. After the Saturn I was the Saturn 1B. I mean, you're learning constantly. Some of the things stay the same, but you're learning, you're advancing, progressing. And that was really Marshall's role was, what had we learned from the Saturn I? A developmental vehicle. Saturn 1B, we're learning more. We're able to use a live upper stage. We had been with the Saturn I, but now we're really going to be able to get further into space. Yeah, Marshall was critical in everything that was leading to the, not only the Saturn V, but everything that led to it. There's all this work that's going on historically that, a lot of people don't know about. They see the Saturn V out there and they kind of forget about the Saturn I. They forget about the Saturn 1B sometimes. I mean, but those things are critically important in teaching us how to develop these techniques. And that was all done here at Marshall. Now the Saturn V itself, I mean, of course the Saturn V is a big piece of Apollo, right? It is Apollo in most people's mind, It's the astronauts, it's these big powerful rockets, and that's, that is Marshall. That's what we do.
Can you tell me about the history of the Saturn V?
Sure. Well, the Saturn V, again, it's an incremental development. We're getting there, we're learning, but the Saturn V is a huge rocket, right? 365 feet tall. I mean, it's huge, it's massive. The power that it generates, its first stage that was tested here at Marshall Space Flight Center, 7.5 million pounds of thrust. These great F1 engines, that people would hear about, rumbling down in Decatur and Birmingham. These things are registered seismically. So it's huge, huge effort. That's just the first stage. That's just getting us off Earth. The second stage of the Saturn V was equally important. The second stage was a critical path that, there were delays in it that people thought we might not make the end of the decade. But the people at North American Aviation, Marshall working with them, I mean, that thing is critical. It's a huge, huge, powerful. We think about the power of the first stage, but we really don't think about the power of the second stage with those J2 engines and that liquid hydrogen. It's so dangerous, but without that giving you the kick to get to orbit, it just wouldn't have been possible. And Marshall managed all of those pieces, right? And ultimately important, the third stage, that S4B stage. I mean, that's what's going to get you into orbit finally, finalize your orbit, and get you to the moon. And that's all a part of this very complicated thing that Marshall has to manage. And you think really, we think about Huntsville and how important Huntsville is in that process, but the Saturn V was a national effort. I mean, pieces coming from all over the country, California, there are certain pieces coming from Wisconsin, it's all over the place, St. Louis. It's a massive effort logistically to get that thing to come together. Kennedy says, we're going to make it by the end of the decade, and just hundreds of thousands of people across the country really putting in some cutting edge, never been done before type work. And that's what the Saturn V is the culmination of that. And you think about the technology that's represented in that. We take for granted today some, microconductors and that sort of thing, but the technology we live with today is a technology that's basically born of developing a Saturn V vehicle to get us to the moon. So these are these things that, NASA talks about today. There's technology transfers, and that's what that was. It was really a paradigm shift in the way we thought about developing these systems. So critical systems, and Marshall's role in that was, unmatched.
So when people did make it to the moon, what was kind of going on here in Huntsville? Was everyone like, hey, we made this happen? Or at the time, what was the
Yeah, the Apollo 11 landing here, a lot of people think back to the Apollo 8. Apollo 8 was when we proved that we could send a human crew around the moon. So at that point, really, Marshall's work has been proven. The Saturn V is going to get the job done. But Apollo 11, the celebrations of actually delivering on Kennedy's goal of landing on the moon by the end of the decade. There are parties in the streets. Von Braun, he's carried on people's shoulders to the courthouse. He gives this speech about how important this thing is, And, so yeah, it's just partying all night, I guess.
Awesome. And is there anything good to mention about Von Braun in there? Would you be able to talk about him just a little bit?
Yeah, sure.
Why he's important? Why he's important to the area?
Yeah, sure. Let's see. I'll frame that up there. Yeah, Dr. Von Braun's group, the German rocket team, when they come to America after World War II, Project Paperclip brought those guys over here. They spend a little bit of time out in Fort Bliss, out in the desert there, really continuing some of the work with the V2 technology that they brought over from Germany. When they're transferred to Huntsville in 1950 to Redstone Arsenal, that has a huge impact, right? Huntsville itself, the city, begins just a transformation from what was cliched sleepy little cotton town, right? But it's just the influx of these people to work on these programs. The Korean War had broken out, and we really needed a delivery system. They had to put together an architecture and an infrastructure that would develop these systems for the military, and eventually those same systems would be reutilized for peaceful purposes of exploration of space. So Von Braun's team brought with them a knowledge base, and really it was the experience. From a theory standpoint, a lot of people were on the same page already about how rockets would work, right? But it was that hard engineering experience that they'd had over the years that they brought with them. And as I mentioned, Huntsville is beginning to change during this time. So these immigrations of these people from around the country and even around the world to Huntsville. Huntsville goes from a city of 15,000 people to a city of well over 100,000 people.